Hi, this is going to be Lononaut's first video, and what we're doing here is something completely different, so let me explain what we're doing. We're trying to make travel something more meaningful, as opposed to just going somewhere and taking a snapshot of a piece of food that you eat, putting it online with something positive to say underneath in the caption. What we're trying to do is try to explore why, despite the fact that we have more communication than ever before, we somehow seem to be speaking past each other more than before. And so what we're trying to do with this company is, number one, try to understand history. And in order to understand history, in order to educate people on history, it's impossible to do it if you're a professor that hasn't traveled, or if you're sitting somewhere and you've only traveled within that one country. Let's talk about why that's the case, so we can set some sort of groundwork. And by the way, there's no script here. This is one of the things that we want to change, or that I want to change. Right now, as of now, it's just me. And one of the reasons we're having problems in media, especially mainstream media, is that the content has been hijacked by people who don't necessarily have something substantive to say, but they're authentic. And since most people in any culture are attracted to authenticity, somehow a lack of substance combined with authenticity has trumped, in most places all over the world, just the opposite spectrum. In other words, if you have somebody that has a script but is reading from it, or that is essentially parroting somebody else's words, at this point in human history, we seem to be rebelling against that dynamic. So we're trying to change that. But let's go back to what we were talking about in terms of history. The reason that you can't understand history without traveling, and I've traveled about 4 times around the world, is that the content of what you see is restricted, regardless of whether or not your government practices censorship overtly or indirectly. And the way it's done is through trade agreements and licensing agreements. So you understand this when you travel. When you travel, you have the same laptop, the same Netflix account, the same media account, and you try to log in, and it says, or YouTube account, and it says content restricted. And again, it's all the same thing, right? You just happen to be in a different place, and somehow you're able not to access simply by moving that laptop and going someplace else, or by taking that phone and going someplace else. You're not able to access what you can access in your quote-unquote home country. Why? Licensing restrictions. And that's because you don't really have a globalized world. You only have a globalized world in terms of products, in terms of things like oil, coffee, and so on. And so you can understand that it's been quite easy to build stories around those things, but not around human beings. Because first of all, you have to understand another language. And when I say I've traveled around the world 4 times, that is in some sense meaningless, because I haven't really been to sub-Saharan Africa, and I only speak, one language fluently, and maybe 2 or 3, very, very badly. And so, despite all that, I've still been able to, at least in the West, put together a cohesive narrative. But that still only, gives me access to knowledge of about 20% of the whole world. So as we're talking about these things, the number one thing you have to understand is that what you see, regardless of censorship, regardless of illegal, doctrine or common law in your country, you are still, in a sense, always censored, because globalization has not prioritized understanding between 2 people. And part of that is because there's not a lot of money in translation. Even if you want to get a famous book that's published in a foreign country, 9 times out of 10, that book will be published or translated only because of other underlying economic activity between those 2 countries. So I'm watching a show right now on Netflix. It's one of my favorite shows. It's the 3rd installment of a romantic comedy series called To All the Boys I've Loved Before. And it's the main character is Korean. It's Korean American. And now you understand that South Korea, we went to war in this country to protect South Korea. That was the basis that we claimed. And Again, this is not a political, we're just going to say facts. We're not going to take sides. So we just want to point out what we see and then let you decide whatever it is that you think is a proper conclusion. But this is not a political business at all. It's just an attempt to provide an independent commentary in order to let people try to come together in a way that is hopefully more meaningful than what's happened in the past. Now, why is the character Korean? Now, she actually travels to Korea. You got to think about what it means to be able to go into another country with a travel crew, with a movie crew. You have to get permission. You have to know people in the country. If you're, you notice it's not a Chinese character. And you notice even in this country, you don't really have too many Chinese people in a outsized role or in a main role in any Netflix special. You do if you go to a foreign country. If I go to Singapore, and in Singapore they speak English because they were colonized by the British, and so they're in a really unique position to be balancing both China and the United States, which took over from the UK post World War II. And so you notice that in this country, if I click on this American website on an American laptop made by an American manufacturer, or I should say an American company, again, it's not going to be a Chinese character because of all the other legal restrictions that are involved in going to a foreign country. And in this case, in this third installment, the main character goes to Korea. But it's also the fact that story could not have been written by somebody in China because there aren't that many diplomatic there aren't that many diplomatic conduits, or not as many as between South Korea and the United States. So in other words, the fact that story was written, it was written in English. So it didn't have to be translated. That's one of the reasons it's so good, because translations are notoriously difficult to get done properly. And I mean, in many cases, you just don't have a word, to translate. You actually have to rewrite the entire sentence. The number of people that speak two languages fluently, very few. The number of people that speak two languages fluently, they want to sit down and then have the intro version necessary to translate documents, or just not forget about documents, entire books. What is it, less than 1%? We can speculate, but probably not even less than 1%. So right away, we've got a problem. But you have to understand that the things you see are biased from the get-go, because that story was written because of a post-World War II, or even basically dynamic between superpowers trying to stake out claims all over the world. And so that's why it's a Korean character, or a Korean-American character, and not a Chinese-American character. And in many cases in America, when we talk about people that we think are Chinese, they're actually from Taiwan. They're Taiwanese. They're of Chinese descent. So we haven't had, one of the consequences of this lack of cultural conduits is, again, what we're seeing now diplomatically and in the trade spectrum. We're seeing a breakdown in communication. So we're trying to fix that. We're trying to get globalization to be about people and not necessarily about things. Because if you understand this, they go together, right? And right now, the economy is really about the free movement of goods and not people. In order to change that, to make it both, you actually have to have these cultural conduits, and you have to have some sort of basis of understanding in order to either achieve some sort of compromise or some sort of common ground. And also to figure out where you can't get that common ground and maybe try to avoid those areas of discussion in order to facilitate, a cultural, just rapport. Now, we just talked about independent. Now, just as by way of background, in the last 8 years, I consider myself independent in the last 8 years. Again, this is not a political, business. I have not voted either for either one of the two primary parties in the United States presidential election in the last 8 years, at least. And in fact, this country is so dominated by the narrative that these two political parties, thrust upon us, that the Federal Election Commission calls anyone that's not these two political parties, they call them minor parties. So again, what you see is censored simply because of history, and history combined with, a lack of licensing, a lack of globalized situation for licensing. It means that suddenly you go to Singapore and you click on your Netflix and you have access to all these shows that you haven't had access to before. And the great thing about Netflix is they're pretty good at translation and so closed captioning. And so, but in order to gain some sort of understanding, you actually have to go to another country. You can use what's called a VPN. And that helps as well. Not always. Companies are catching on. Amazon in particular is quite good at shutting that down. So it's always a race between people that really want globalization and people that don't, because there's a lot of profit to be made in terms of restricting people or competitors into your domain, into your territory. And that's really what it's all about. And that's really what it's always been about. Now, when I say I'm independent, it's not just from a political spectrum. Remember, this is something where I will probably tell as far as I know, I'm only biased in favor of a few things. One of them is reunification between Malaysia and Singapore. I have a lot of respect for these two countries because they've come out of this post-World War II colonization paradigm and succeeded in completely different ways. And so I'm pro both countries, and I'm in favor of them, reuniting, which is, which is sort of a back to the future, in the sense that they used to be one country. So I'm biased in favor of them. I like the color red in part because it's, Singaporean, Indonesian, and so on and so forth. So I probably am biased in favor of, the future belonging to Asia. Now, let's see, what else? I'm probably biased in favor of groups that have stood for something in the past, and as a result, been marginalized. So in this country, I'm in favor of a lot of the Christian minority, minority religions, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, who were beaten in schools because they were apolitical. And so they refused to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. And as a result, during war, during times of conflict, people want you to take sides. The Jehovah's Witnesses have a history of not taking sides. And as a result, they were beaten. The cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. And one of the reasons that we don't, from a legal basis, rather than an economic basis, one of the reasons that we have this idea of free speech in this country with respect to a opposition to government censorship, one of the reasons we have that is because of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Supreme Court cases that they are responsible for. I'm in favor of the Mennonites, the Amish, and any other sort of small, Christian sect that was anti-war back when it counted. And they suffered for it. They were driven out of New York. They had to leave New York and go to Iowa. The only reason they're still in Iowa is because a sheriff who was independent protected them. And this was during a draft. And so the idea was that these people were causing other people's children to die in a war because, just based on a numerical system, if some people were able to exempt themselves from the military draft, then that meant a higher chance that a non-Mennonite or a non-Amish would be drafted and be sent away, based on the population demographics and so on and so forth, and the way the draft was fashioned. Beyond that, I'm sure I have other biases, but those are the ones that I know about. In other words, I'm really trying to, create a truly independent media channel, so to speak. And that's basically it. That's my introduction to Lononaut. And hopefully we can try to figure out, more topics as we go forward. Right now, there's a pandemic, so we can't really travel that much. If at all, I'm going to try to travel within the U.S. a little bit more. But, overall, what we're trying to do is bring an international sort of perspective. And by the way, it's not just media, digital media that's segregated. It's also just books. I have a book that talks about China's, all the different plans they have. That purports to speak on behalf of Premier Xi and the leader of China. And that book is not available in this country. The only reason I was able to see it was because I went to a book fair in Singapore, which has connections with China. The majority of the population in Singapore are of Chinese descent. Obviously, that has an impact on the culture and of the ability to understand what's going on in China firsthand because of the language similarities. Usually, sometimes when you break off, you tend to create your own language. or your own translations and so on and so forth. So we have a very fragmented body of knowledge to explore. But in order to make globalization work, we have to do it. So my bookshelf in Singapore is unavailable here unless I pay thousands of dollars, right? I mean, somebody somewhere would have to buy the book there, ship it to me. There's no way to really figure out what the demand is, right? So no one's going to buy a book to ship to the US, given all the different content restrictions, because there's no way to figure out the data on, that sort of enterprise. So again, that's why globalization has been about things. If you make a good cup of coffee, someone's going to buy that. If you drill for natural gas, someone's going to buy that somewhere. You don't really know that with a book or a show and so on and so forth. A lot of those are still local. And so as we try to explore, keep all of that in mind, that we are just starting. We're on the cusp of true globalization. And the only way we're going to get there to some sort of mutual understanding that prevents, perpetual war, is to try to have better media and to try to have truly independent voices. And I'm going to try my best to get there. And with the caveat that this is not a political, I'm not paid by anyone to say any of these things. This is just me hoping to communicate in a way that is unique and that will be helpful to bringing people together. Whether or not it works, I don't know. I'm sure I'll have to get more polished at some point. Opening a business here is not easy. I'm still waiting for my fictitious business name. There are all these things we have to do. I'm not even sure if I can wear a logo here. I'm not sure about that. I could get sued. I don't know. And I've studied law, and I don't know these things. So remember, when you combine the inefficacy of the educational system in terms of practical knowledge, and you combine that with the media, practical media restrictions, most of us don't know anything. And as a result, most of us are susceptible to fake news. By the way, I just remembered, I'm not sponsored by anybody. That might be the way to go, right? You can probably wear these things as long as you say you're not sponsored by anybody. These are all your own independent thoughts and so on and so forth. So the Nike and the Oklahoma wrestling, this is for personal use. They just happen to be clean. That's why I'm wearing them. And I happen to like the color red. I am also biased in favor of wrestling, especially in Oklahoma, where they have University of Oklahoma and, of course, John Smith over in Oklahoma State. That's a truly international sport. People think soccer is the most international sport. It's not. It's wrestling. It's Olympic freestyle wrestling. That is the most international sport. And so I'm definitely biased in favor of that sport. And I've been lucky enough to be exposed to that sport. And as a result, it's one of those things where you don't know, the chicken or the egg. Did I become interested in globalization because of my interests? My interests happen to overlap with things that were international, activities that were international in scope. Or was it just, this idea that I'm hoping to get more knowledge because I'm frustrated with how the world is operating right now in a way that's not optimal? We don't know. And that, I guess, is what we'll end up with. We don't know. We're all just trying the best we can. And hopefully we'll get someplace together that is useful and substantive.